Hi, welcome everybody. Living Chassidus, welcome to the Living Chassidus class. So Living Chassidus is a Chabad house for single and newly married women here in Crown Heights. And we want to give a special thank you for everyone who's joining us tonight. Um, and also thank our Chai Club donors for making this a reality. Um, You could check out our previous classes on YouTube and Spotify by just searching for Living Chassidus. Um, so as women, we usually grow up with Yiddishkeit and relationships to Hashem. That's very similar to men's relationship to Hashem. Lots of to-do lists and checklists. Then once we get married, we have children and our Yiddishkeit evolves and we're left to figure out how all this makes sense. Today, we have Dr. Chava Green joining us to speak about this. So about Chava. The topic is Yiddishkeit, what I do or who I am. So the topic is about how a woman's relationship with Yiddishkeit shifts over time based on the life stages that she's in. So she's going to be delving into the teachings of Chassidus and telling us about how to navigate our Jewish practices as we move into all the stages from single to married to childbearing. And when we understand how a woman's relationship to Torah and Mitzvos is and is like a deep flowing river rather than a set of boxes and checklists, we can move through life with more confidence in our role as a Jewish woman. So Chava Green is currently a visiting scholar in Jewish studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a PhD in religion from Emory University and a BA in Women's and Gender Studies from Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And Chava attended a number of seminaries after college, including Mayano and Machanalta. She speaks and writes about her work at the intersection of feminism and Hasidic thought. She currently lives in Philadelphia with her husband and 3 children. Yeah, and without further ado, Chava.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, I guess when I'm spotlighted, I can only see the people with their pictures on anyway, so it works out. I have my audience. Thank you guys. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and also some people that I don't know. So, hi guys. So just to start, I'll introduce myself a little bit and talk about I'm going to really weave together my own personal experiences with this question of what is a woman's Judaism with my research in Chassidus and my academic research on women in Judaism. So I grew up very secular, and my dad is not Jewish, my mom is, and I didn't identify as even being Jewish like until I was in college. It was like a non-aspect of my personality, my identity. And I went on a birthright trip and I was a radical feminist. And there was some like issues in feminism that I felt like I wasn't getting to the root of, or I wasn't really satisfied with the answers I was getting. Like just give you one example, like what we wear and how that impacts kind of how we're received in society. And so feminism had one version of what that looks like, which is like you can wear whatever you want and there's a freedom in dressing however you want. And I thought, well, I don't really see that reflecting positively in society in like elevating a woman's status. It seems like it's kind of denigrating women's status. And I went on Birthright and I started learning about Judaism. And there was like these different pieces within feminism that I felt like had not been resolved. That when I came to Judaism, it was like it was like a whole different world, and there were so many like different perspectives that I hadn't heard of coming from a secular background. And so I really dove full force into learning about Judaism. And eventually, for so many reasons, I decided to become Shomer Shabbos. And by my senior year in college, I was keeping Shabbos and kosher, dressing sort of modestly. I would wear like my old skirts over jeans and things like that. But I was on my path, and I carried with me my interest in feminism, which over time I started realizing was not necessarily about feminism per se, but really about what does it mean to be a woman? Because I think in society it was pretty clear what does it mean to be a person. Like we're raised with values, we're raised understanding the culture we come from. And for me, that might have begun as a secular culture, but when I came to learn about Judaism, I understood what is Judaism. But I always carried with me this question of, yeah, but what is specific and unique about being a woman? And I might have my own kind of inner experiences of that, but what does it really mean on like a deeper level? And also, what are the parts in me that are feminine that I might not even be exploring? Because so much of our society is actually built on a masculine model, and especially in the secular world, which for me was like this huge like realization when I came to Judaism, that I was like, oh, this is a community that still has a really discrete and powerful model of what it means to be a woman. And so that's what I have now spent who's messaging base Hana, hi. um, so we so I took that question with me as I was going through my education. And so I studied women's studies in undergrad, and then in um, and then in my graduate program, what I did for my PhD was go through the Rebbe's Sichas about womanhood and gender more broadly, and try to piece together a complex and comprehensive view of what does it mean to be a Jewish woman through the lens of Chassidus. And what was so powerful for me was a big part of my project was speaking with individuals. I interviewed almost 50 women from all different backgrounds, from all stages of life, and I asked them about their experiences as being a Jew, being a woman, being connected to the Rebbe, and in each person in their own journey of life, what those different identities have meant to them. And so I was really excited talking to Michal about this topic of a woman's particular relationship to Judaism as it evolves over our life, because the idea of mashpia makabel as man and woman, because I was recently interviewed for a documentary, and they were like, "What is femininity in Judaism?" And I'm like, I'm not an expert in Hebrew, but I don't think we have a word femininity. Like the idea of masculine and feminine in Judaism is mashpia makabel. It's not just a general term; it's actually a specific category. It's a specific modality of operating in the world, and it has specific characteristics. And one of the examples of mashpia makabel that comes from the even before Adam and Chava are created is the two great lights, the sun and the moon. And the sun is the mashpia, giving the light, and the moon is the makabel. She receives and reflects the light of the sun. And so the paradigm I want us to kind of carry with us as we go through this conversation tonight is to look at ourselves as having both mashpia makabel within us, that we are both the light because we have our own chelek elokam yimal mamish, our own piece of Hashem within us, and we are also the makabel. And we are primarily the makabel in this world, in our practical manifestation of who we are, even though we carry mashpia makabel energy within us. Okay, and what is the makabel as the moon? The makabel is constantly spinning and sometimes reflecting the sun fully, and then sometimes she's dark. She's not reflecting the sun, but she's still there. She doesn't disappear. So like whatever, I could go into a whole conversation with my son about like, where's the moon? I'm like, still there, but not reflecting the light, so we can't see it. Like we know the moon is still there, but sometimes it's dark. And so another paradigm of masculine feminine is also emes and amuna. Emes is masculine, it never changes. Just like the sun's light, it is always shining. truth is truth no matter what. But Amuna is like the moon. Amuna is what takes us through the dark times when our MS is not as clear, when we are in a period where we don't see the light and we hold on to that Amuna. And so this feminine characteristic I want you to understand operates on many different levels. And so too in our personal relationship with Judaism. We sometimes have periods of being in the moon cycles and also in the place of Amuna, where the MS is not as revealed in us, and yet we hold something even deeper. Okay, so with that introduction, I wanted to bring a sikha from the Rebbe that talks about specifically about the different relationship that men and women have to the Torah. So I think Rachel posted that I have a handout. If you want to follow along, you can open it up. It's in the notes or the chat, or you can just listen along. But I made it as like a very clear outline. One of the things I've been really enjoying doing as part of my research is taking the Rebbe Sichas and organizing them really clearly in like visual format. Because sometimes when we learn sichas, at least for me, like if I'm going to learn about the parsha, I'll learn it that one time, and sometimes you get all the questions in the beginning, you don't even get to the answer at the end, and we don't always have sichas that we go back to many times. But I've been really privileged to have certain sichas that I've been learning, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 times, like, and each time I'm seeing the thread of the Rebbe's kind of argument or his position become more and more clarified. So this is a sikha from Parshas Yisro in Tafshin Mem Daled, and he gave it specifically to the Neshei Chabad convention, and it is about the scene at Matan Torah. So the Jewish people come to Har Sinai. And what does Hashem say to Moshe? He says, Kai Saimar Beis Yaakov u'Lasagi leBnei Yisrael. Go speak to Beis Yaakov and then tell Bnei Yisrael the Torah, right? So most of us should know already the basic mafarshim on the pasuk ask, why are the Jewish people like repeated twice and with two different languages of how Hashem spoke to them? And so the answer is that Beis Yaakov refers to the women. They were spoken to one way, and Bnei Yisrael refers to the men. They were spoken to the other way. Okay, so the Rebbe starts off with just this basic concept. And then right away, he brings two totally different perspectives on what it means to be a Jewish woman. Because what is so powerful about this pasuk is that it teaches us that Hashem gave the women the Torah first. Okay? Now, if we think about Jewish history, we don't see, Jewish women who were leaders of communities, who were writing Sfarim, who were Rabbanim, who we even have like biographies about from 600, 800 years ago. Like throughout Jewish history, it seems that men have had the greater chelek, the greater shaykhis to Torah, and women's relationship is, one could seem that it's like secondary, like men have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah that women don't. So the commentators kind of hold this question and they ask, well, why did women receive the Torah first? Almost in a way of like surprise. Okay, so the Rebbe brings two different perspectives. One is the Mechilta, two different midrashish sources. One is the Mechilta and one is Midrash Rabbah. And they're going to paint the two different views that the world, and even within Judaism, has had of women. Okay, so first we have if anyone's following along on the sheet, first we have the source side, which is the Mechilta Midrash Rabbah, and then underneath we have each different kind of facet of this topic, and then how these two different perspectives take it, okay? All right, so first, the Mechilta says, what is these two different words, speak versus tell? So the Mechilta, he says speaking versus telling is the way that Hashem spoke to them. When Hashem spoke to the women, he said it in a lashon raka, a soft, appealing way. He came and spoke to their hearts. when he came to the women, it was like in this manner. And the men, it was just very like digdukim, the details, the specifics. That was it. Midrash Rabbah takes a different perspective and says the reason Hashem said it differently to the men and the women is because of the different capacities of the receiver, the different capacities of men and women to understand the Torah. And so women could only understand, and he uses the term Roshei Devarim, the headings. Now, this is going to be central to the Rebbe's argument throughout this whole Sikha, that women received the Torah first, and they only received the Roshei Devarim, the headings, so to speak. Whereas the Midrash Rabbah is saying the men could understand everything. So Hashem gave them all of the details. Okay, so now we have two really different perspectives. The Mechilta is saying Hashem spoke in a beautiful way to the women, and then the men, he spoke a little bit more harshly. The Midrash Rabbah is taking this a totally different way, saying the women don't have a capacity to understand the whole Torah. So Hashem gave them a little bit, and then he went to the men and gave them all of the details. Okay, so now let's go to a deeper level. What is this headings, Roshei Devarim? Midrash Rabbah says headings are like when a teacher gives information to their students. They just condense it to a little bit so that the students can understand. So I just taught high school, and I would come in with like an entire mimer in my head, and I would just pull out a few lines to give to the girls, and then we would discuss those because maybe they're 16 and they don't have the capacity yet to delve into deep philosophical discussions that require a certain level of maturity. So from the perspective of Midrash Rabbah, that's how Hashem viewed the Jewish women, that they could only receive small amounts, just the heading of each topic. The Mechilta takes it a totally different way, and here's the crucial turning point in how we're going to understand a woman's relationship to Judaism. The Mechilta says headings are like a seed. They include everything that is going to branch out from them. The heading gives you the whole essence, the whole idea of what something is, so that then you already have an entry point into understanding everything else. It's all contained in that beginning point. And the Rebbe is going to show over and over again about that is the path of Yiddishkeit. Okay, so first he says, like the whole Gemara, the whole oral law is hinted to in the Mishnah. Okay, and even at Matan Torah itself, the whole Torah was given in the Aleph of Anaichi. Why did Hashem first give just the 10 commandments, just the first commandment, even that first letter coming from Hashem? Why did he do that? And we know like our bodies were like, our souls like blown out of our bodies when Hashem just spoke that first word. It was because he was giving us the entire Torah, the entire relationship to us in one letter. Okay, so the Mechilta's perspective is that when the women were given the Roshei Devarim, they were given everything in like a seed. Okay, so what is the implications for women's relationship to the Torah then? So the Midrash Rabbah says since women's minds are less sophisticated, so then they need a simpler Yiddishkeit, which unfortunately, this was a perspective that exists in Judaism. And even now, like a woman I interviewed as part of my dissertation, she was saying that she grew up in Borough Park. And there was another Hasidic group that she had a friend, and the girl was saying that her teacher was just giving them too much information. And she's like, girls can't understand this. Like, I'm a girl, I can't understand this. And I just need it to be simple for me. And she was growing up as a Lubavitcher, and she was like, what? Like, you're a girl, so you need simple? Like, she was like, that doesn't even make sense from her perspective, Judaism. But this is unfortunately an idea in Judaism, even in other we could say other communities. The Mechilta says, okay, women specifically needed to be given the whole Torah and it first. Okay, so what is the relationship between women and the Torah? If they were given the headings, it means that they have the relationship to the entire thing. They need to get it first. And he actually adds, it will include everything that will be given to the men. Which is very interesting because in another Sikha, Parshas Emor Sikha, the Rebbe talks about how women's relationship to Talmud Torah, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, they might not have, but they actually do have a mitzvah to learn all of the halachas that they need in order to live a Jewish life. And I love the Rebbe's Sichas. In a little parentheses, he writes, halavai, all the men should know those halachas as well. So, like, the Rebbe had such a high estimation of us that we need to be learning and absorbing so much, So, of course, we're here tonight in the merit of the Rebbe's vision of what it means to be a Jewish woman. Okay, so What are some practical implications in our Yiddishkeit to this? And we're going to keep expanding on this more and more, but I want to use the Sikha as kind of like a way to ground this conversation. Um, so now the Rebbe starts talking about why are women exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, which I think is a really interesting question, because if we're following the logic of this conversation, like you could almost picture it as a conversation between the Midrash Rabbah and the Mechilta, like a debate, right? So the Midrash Rabbah is presenting this one perspective, and Mechilta is presenting the other one. And so the Midrash Rabbah is saying women don't have a relationship to all of the Torah. Adrabah, they were given a lesser amount, just the amount that they can handle. And the Mechilta is saying, no, women were giving the entire Torah. Why is the Midrash Rabbah so sexist? Well, I'm saying this was a perspective in Judaism. And I'm going to go back to this a little bit later. But remember, I was saying about the sun and the moon. I don't know if you have learned this before in other places, but the moon came to Hashem and said, you created the sun and the moon equal, but two kings can't share one crown. And Hashem said to the moon, so go diminish yourself. And the moon was very upset about this. I don't want to be the smaller light. And yet Hashem said throughout history, there will be, the small ones will be named after you, and the Jewish people count the months after you. And the moon was just like, I don't want to be small. And at the end, Hashem says, okay, bring an atonement for me for diminishing the moon. And so an aspect of gullus is also the gullus of the Shekhinah, the gullus of the feminine. And so the fact that we have the perspective of this, like the Midrash Rabbah, that women are less capable intellectually, so we have to recognize this as a real function of gullus. And that, like the Rebbe's Mashiach vision, was a very important part of that, was lifting and raising up the status of women. Okay, so if we have these two perspectives, Midrash Rabbah is saying women got just a smaller amount of the Torah, and the Mechilta is saying no, they received everything in a condensed form. So then how do we deal with the reality that women are exempt from a number of mitzvahs, that we don't, not only do we not have to perform them, but in many regards we are not, I don't want to say allowed, but we're not obligated in them, like a minyan. If we're not obligated to daven 3 times a day, then that obligation exempts us from that being counted in the minyan, right? So this is kind of a challenge to the argument of the Mechilta. So what does the Rebbe respond? So again, Midrash Rabbah says women can't really handle that. More mitzvahs, like those are ones that are beyond their capacity. What does the Mechilta say? Women are connected to all of the mitzvahs, full stop. However, practically they're exempt from some of them, but the time-bound mitzvahs were also given to women, okay? Just because they don't do them doesn't diminish the fact that they were given to them, okay? What does that mean? How do we understand that? So the Arizal says, at the time a man performs a mitzvah, his wife, the woman, does not need to do it, because while he is doing it at that moment, she is also doing it. However, this does not apply to negative mitzvahs, meaning if a man's refraining from doing something, she can't start doing it. But if he's performing a positive time-bound mitzvah, at that moment, she's also doing it. Why? Because a man and a woman are like one body. Okay, so Kabbalistically, the idea of a neshama is that when it's in Shemayim, a neshama before it comes into the world is a composite of like Adam and Chava. They were first created as one and then they were split. So our neshamas, when it's in, I don't know where neshamas are in the Kisei Kavod or something, before we come down into the world, our neshamas are both masculine and feminine together as one. And when they come into this world, they split into the masculine side and the feminine side. And that's really the deepest idea of a soulmate, is that when you get married to your soulmate, those two pieces of the neshama, they come back together. And a man and a woman become like one body. And interestingly, the Rebbe mentions here, that's why women even mention in benching the bris. It's like, I'm forgetting the exact lesson, but the bris that you command us in our bodies, because their husband had a bris. And so they actually mention that in benching. And the Rebbe adds here that also women who are not married yet, they still perform the positive mitzvahs that their future spouse does. Because on a neshama level, they're still fulfilling the mitzvahs through their spouse. And a different sikha, about the Ikar Sabayis, the Rebbe also brings this up. And I'm forgetting, he adds something else there, I'm forgetting right now. But this is a topic that the Rebbe has mentioned a few times. And there's another sikha where the Rebbe asks, like, how could women be left out of something and not receive the schar for an aspect of Torah? Because of this particular perspective of the Rebbe, the women have a relationship to all of Yiddishkeit, to all of Torah. He actually asks, like, how could they be left out? And this is his answer again, that they're actually fulfilling it in the same way. And this idea is actually going to be really, really crucial when we move into kind of hopefully have a little bit of a discussion of Farbrengen later after this about like practically how do we take all these ideas and then put them into our emotional and kind of intellectual experience of Judaism. Okay, finally, just to end off, when Hashem spoke to the women first at Har Sinai, and he spoke to them in a soft voice. If you remember, that was from the very first difference between the Mechilta and the Midrash Rabbah, is that the Midrash Rabbah doesn't mention the way that Hashem spoke to them. He doesn't say if it was soft or strong, and the Mechilta does. Why? The Rabbah comes back at the end and he says the idea of Hashem speaking to them in a soft voice, in an almost more caring voice, actually highlights the advantage of women's avodas Hashem over men. Whereas in Mechilta, he doesn't even mention the word, right? So finally, in the last paragraph, I wrote here, guess which the Rebbe finds as a more accurate argument about women's relationship to the Torah. So under Mechilta, I wrote, yep, this one. Because he says, we see throughout all different parts of Judaism that we have this idea of the essence of something being distilled. And that's very important because essence and revelation are complete opposites. They cannot exist at the same time. Because anything that's deeply, deeply essential, when it becomes revealed, it loses something in that process. And that's a necessary process of revelation. We want to have a revealed experience of God, of Hashem. But essence is something that resists being revealed. It can't be revealed. And so when Hashem wanted to give the essence of the Torah to the Jewish people, he gave it first to the women in a very, very condensed, small way that we would carry it with us, okay? Why? To step back for a moment, why exactly was this essence given to the women? Okay, so part 2 of the Sikha, the last part, says, what is this advantage of women's avodas Hashem? So it's very interesting. I've thought about this a lot, what the Rebbe means by this. He says, so in the language of the Midrash Rabbah, he brings up a few times about how women are nashim dalos kala. This idea of like women having less das, less like intellectual comprehension. That's how you could translate it. And comparing that to the fact that the men received all the dikdukim, the details of the Torah, so he's kind of using this comparison. The Rebbe always learns out a milah from anything that could seem negative. Okay, and so this is something that, having learned so many sikhas about women, oftentimes the Rebbe will take something that in the past had been read a certain way, perhaps with like a slightly negative view, and he reads into it something positive and even an advantage in women's avodas Hashem. A classic one is the sikha about Dinah going out. And Rashi says, why was Dinah abducted? Because she went out inappropriately into the field. Like, women are safe in their homes when they go out. Anything could happen. And the Rebbe like shifts that whole sikha, like that whole conversation around. And he says, no, Dinah, the fact she was abducted is a totally different reason. The fact that Dinah went out like shows the power of Jewish women to influence the world beyond even their Dalit Amos, like the whole world. So the Rebbe always like kind of flips things over for the positive. So this idea of women having less das, so if you go into what exactly is das versus Chachma Bina das, we have different intellectual capacities. Das is being like very, very like connected and stuck on one thing. And that's kind of a characteristic you need for all of the details, to get stuck in the details. And the Rebbe says the fact that women maybe have a little bit less of that particular capacity means that they don't get stuck and bogged down in the details, but rather they can have a more pure emunah in Hashem, a more like clear view of it's just from Hashem. And it's really interesting because my husband's been learning Shara B'Tachon, which is amazing, and and I'm sure the Rebbe encourage everyone to learn it. But I also see the ways that, he's approaching his business now in like very much like, okay, Shara B'Tachon said like this aspect, that aspect, applying all these different specific parts of like B'Tachon and learning. And sometimes I'll just be like, right, the basic point is it just all comes from Hashem. All the money just comes from Hashem. Like, I love getting into the details. I love learning, but like, there is this aspect that we have as women to sometimes zoom back and remind ourselves and the people in our life, it's just from Hashem. This is just what Hashem wants. And so the Rebbe says this is actually a really big advantage in a women's avodas Hashem. That sometimes when we're in a period of our life where we're more in the moon phase, the makabel phase, and we might not have as much access to learning, we might not be as much into an intellectual mode in our Yiddishkeit. We have this like really raw connection with Hashem that we can just bring this amuna like into any situation. And that's a power that we have to know that we have. Okay, so where do we see this essential connection to Hashem most revealed in Judaism is when we look at the process of Jewish lineage. The essence of a Jew depends on his or her mother. Okay, so anyone born to a Jewish woman is Jewish. And for me, like, we all have our different relationships with the Rebbe. And for me, like learning the Rebbe's sichas is my way of really, really connecting. And so in this line in the Sikha, the Rebbe writes, one born to a Jewish woman is Jewish. And then parentheses, he writes, even if the father is not Jewish. And I don't know if you remember in the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned my dad's not Jewish. And I used to like, when I was first becoming frum, like I wasn't sure how like reconcile this, whatever. So when I read this line in the Sikha, I was just like, oh, like the Rebbe is just like throwing that in for me, because our essence really comes from our mother, who we are deep inside, like beyond any facets of our personality, our essence is from our mother. And the father gives the type of Jew. If a child is going to be a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael, that comes from the father. But those are already categories that are now above the essence of being a Jew. And so the Rebbe writes, the holiness, the very existence of the Jewish people depends on the woman. And that is why she was given the Torah first. Okay, so to go back to this idea of women being exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, the Rebbe says if we're moving into this realm, so when I wrote about this in my dissertation, I thought a lot about women's relationship to Torah being holistic. And I felt like that was a term that just kind of clicked for me a little bit better than essential, because sometimes essential is in English is kind of like not really sure exactly what that means. But holistic really clicked for me that it's something that kind of includes everything, but it's not just about one or two things. Like it's not just about the details. It's about those. It includes them, but it's also much bigger than that. It's also much more, to use the language of Chassidus makif, like surrounding us, and even like specifically like in our homes, like the impact that we have in creating that warm home. It's like we know that it's not about all the details. It's really about the whole energy and vibe and experience of like what our home feels like. And so the Rebbe says, why are women exempt from time-bound mitzvahs? He actually brings a really interesting idea that because those mitzvahs have an element of constriction to them, of like they're like the opposite of holistic. Like they can only be performed at a certain time, and in that way, they have like this hagbala, this like boundary around them that is just at odds with the nature of a woman's relationship to Torah, which is beyond delineations, beyond constriction. So like the male side of the neshama can take care of those pieces, and like the woman's side is like in a way like needs to be more creative, needs to be more like adapting to the time. And so just to end off the part of the Sikha, the Rebbe ends by saying, in the merit of the righteous women in Mitzrayim, the Yidden were redeemed in the merit of the righteous women from Mitzrayim, and it's only because of them that they even got to Har Sinai to receive the Torah. So all the more so they should receive it first. And so too in our generation, it's in the merit of us, the Jewish women now, that we will bring Mashiach. And when Mashiach comes, he's going to teach us a Torah that is in a way of seeing. that we're actually not going to hear the Torah. We're going to learn it in a way that it will be so obvious, will be seen, and the essence of the Torah will be revealed, and it should happen soon, immediately in our days. Um, okay, so before I move on, I want to take a look at see if there was any questions. Okay, so Hamasha said how the Rebbe reconciles, unites both perspectives. Interesting. So I think in the end, he kind of shows how the Midrash Rabbah's perspective doesn't align with the broader view of Judaism. But it's a really good question of like, this is a important midrash, and how do we kind of understand that? And I was thinking that, um, yeah, I've thought a lot about like like kind of how Judaism responds to some feminist claims, and there's this idea of like responding to things in an apologetic way of like, no, it's not really like that, and I'm going to show you why it's really all great. And something that I've really thought a lot about through my research is actually looking at the ways in which like women have not always had access to certain things, and that as we get closer to Mashiach, as we understand like the very like deep geula energy of the Rebbe's teachings, is that he actually changed some of those things. And like there's like a Haisafa at the end of one of the Chilukim of Likutei Sichas, where the Rebbe talks about this interesting idea that when Mashiach comes, the old men and women of Yerushalayim will like sit in the streets together. And in another place, like the idea that the voice of the Kal and the voice of the Chassan will be heard in the streets of Yerushalayim. And the Rebbe says, like, how can we reconcile this? That's not tznius, that men and women will sit together, that they will sing together. And so his first answer is that when Mashiach comes in the time of Geula, there won't be a Yetzer Hara. We won't have those like animal nefesh bahamis issues that is the reason for tznius. And so that will be fine. But then he says, but everything's part of Torah has to have a hayra for us now. So what do we learn from this now when there still is the Yetzer Hara? And it's so interesting. His answer is that we see in our generation that there are educational institutions for girls that never existed in the past. That women, their whole education, their whole hashpah of Yiddishkeit was from their home. And it was, in a sense, there was a limitation to that because it depended on the atmosphere of their home. It depended on the education of their parents. And so the fact that we have women now going out into the world and having educational institutions just like men, he's like, the Rebbe says we don't even realize how much of a chiddush that is in Jewish history. This is like actually a really powerful, incredible thing, and valuing women's education. And so this is an important piece of understanding the fact that like our role as Jewish women has actually really, really changed than it was 100 years ago, for certainly 500 years ago. We still might all be making challah like our, great, great, great ancestors did. But our relationship to Torah is much more revealed now. Okay. So yeah, so someone said it must also be true. Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm saying. Like that it did exist. This kind of like limitations on women, or at least the way women were perceived, did exist in Judaism. And the Rebbe's, I think what he always is doing is like unpacking the layers. Okay. So where should we take this next? Does anybody have any more questions or anything? Or I'm happy to flesh this out more. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience of implementing this idea of like my relationship being to Yiddishkeit having both revelation and essence. Is it what I do, or is it who I am? Right. So this is the question. So I think each of us has probably a different nuance in how kind of how much stake we have in this question, right? Like how important is it that your Yiddishkeit is about what you do? I think on some level all of us feel it, but some might feel it more. And we when we start off, especially if we've gone to seminary and spent a significant amount of time learning, and also some people like love davening, some people love being in shul. Like there's aspects of Judaism that are very much I call it like revelation Judaism. Like they feel good, even though it's a voda. Like it doesn't always feel good to pick up a sitter and daven, but like if it's like part of your practice and you're working on it, you get into it. And so that is a tremendous shift when you get married and when you start having children, because so many of those things become difficult to fit in. And also it becomes a question of like, well, which is my priority? Are those things still the same priority that they were before? I think this is the questions that are coming in. Um, yeah, stages and how does it change? Yeah. Um, right, especially we've been taught from male teachers. I think that's also a really important point. Um, so I'll give you a few examples of like practically of like those moments of like mental shift for me in my life. So I remember we were living in Atlanta. I was in a graduate program. My husband and I, we were running YJPs. We were on shlichus there. And I actually found out I was pregnant the day we moved to Atlanta, which was like really crazy. There was so much going on in my life. Recently married, having a baby, starting a graduate program, going on shlichus. Not, needless to say, it was like a very intense, Shana Rishona. Um, but for me, like davening was my grounding, like center. I would wake up, I would daven, have breakfast, and then some point during my day, I would find time to daven mincha. And even especially when I was in like an academic setting, it was so powerful for me to like step away and find a quiet room and daven. And I vividly remember the day I got home from the hospital with my first child. And the hospital was like a blur. My son was in the NICU. I was like barely like functional. After like 4 days of that, we got home and I woke up the next morning and I couldn't daven. I was thinking about it and I was like so out of it. And I just didn't daven chakras and I didn't daven mincha. And the day ended. And I was like, literally, like, I can't believe, like, it's been, I've been davening for like 6 years, like twice a day. I remember in seminary, we learned about tashlumin, which is like making up a davening if you miss it. And we learned it inside. It was in my note. It was very text based. I think we learned it in the Gemara. And I remember after I got married, I started like davening. I was still davening when I got married before I had a baby. And I remember we were living in Morristown, and I went to our family mashpia, and I said, I miss mincha. Should I do tashlumin at Mariv to like make up for that davening? And he laughed at me. He was like, we don't really do that. Like, it's okay. You just missed a davening. But I was like very, very committed. Like, I have to make it up. And so when my son was born and I didn't daven that day, I felt so much guilt. I felt so much distance from Hashem. I felt so like out of sorts. And I remember going back to our family mashpia. I should give him credit. His name's Rabbi Brofman in Morristown. And he is, you spoke about like having male teachers, but he's like a man who very much embodies like a feminine energy. And he really experiences more that like makabel energy. And I'm going to give another example that he spoke to me about later. But that time he said, like, what I loved about his answers, he didn't brush me off like, you don't have to daven anymore. He understood that I wanted like a structure. I wanted to know I was doing the right thing. And he said, you need to say berachas hashachar, brachas in the morning, and say shema at night. And then one time a day, just say to Hashem, please help me. And that is your biblical obligation of davening. The Rambam says davening is actually when you are in a moment of stress, distress, challenge, and you cry out to Hashem. That is the baseline biblical obligation of davening. And so when this rabbi, this mashpia, he gave me like this new framework of like, right, I'm still a Jew. I still wake up. I wash my hands. I say brachas. But that like paradigm of the kind of structure of chakras and mincha, it's now transitioning into a different kind of davening, which is speaking to Hashem from my heart. And what I did was I would have times where I would just check in with myself over the years. So that was 6 years ago. Baruch Hashem, my son actually just had his birthday last week. He turned 7. And I have 2 more little kids. And over the years, there would be plenty of periods where I would, be sleeping through the night. I wasn't nursing. My kids would be in daycare and I would go back to davening. And it felt good. And it wouldn't necessarily be in the same rigorous way, but it would be a way of like, it's part of my life, whether or not I'm opening a sitter or not, but it's part of my life. And I remember speaking to a woman who, like, I saw kind of the opposite, that like davening had just completely left from her life. And somebody said, like, do you ever daven? She was like, I schmooze with God. And as like a Freudian slip, the person was like, you snooze, you lose. Like, but and it was like kind of awkward, but kind of the point was that she didn't have it like as like a pillar in her life. And I think that as much as we might not be like, even it might be a time period also where like we're not even thinking about it because we might have a newborn baby, or we might be newly married and our husband, we really want to have breakfast for him when he comes back from shul, and like it's like stressful to like get it to like daven in the middle of that. And like there's just time periods where it's like you understand my relationship with Hashem is going to be evolving, and I need to have mashpia to understand like what is it now, and like for me that's been a really core piece of like reaching out to a family rav, a mashpia, of like, okay, I'm in this new stage, like help me figure out what it looks like. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my next example of this, also with Rabbi Brofman in Morristown. So my was this was before my daughter was born, so I actually went through a period of like secondary infertility. So I had my son was born, and then I didn't have my daughter for 3 years after that. And so in that period there was like, ups and downs emotionally and whatever. And at some point, I started also understanding like Hashem is giving me a bracha now that I can like be learning. I could be davening. I'm working. I was in graduate school, and I just made space for the other things in my life. And I was coming up to Rosh Hashanah when my son was, I think, like 2.5, and I was starting to like get nervous about Rosh Hashanah. I'm like, okay, my toddler is crazy. Like he's not the kind where you give him snacks and a book and he'll like sit in the corner. Like he's bouncing off the walls and like every time I open a sitter, he like knows, oh, this is the time to like go to mommy and like, pull our sheetal or like whatever. And so I had this idea of like when we were on shluchas for the 2 years previous, Rosh Hashanah, I would get a babysitter, or like people at shul would, be around to help me. But now I was living in community, and I was really like getting worked up of like, what is my Rosh Hashanah going to look like? Like, am I going to be able to daven? Am I going to be able to go to shul? What should I do with my son? Like, how am I going to make it a meaningful day? And it was like getting wrapped up in all these things. And so my husband's like, why don't you go talk to Ari Brofman? So I went to speak to Ari Brofman, and I said, like, I really feel like I'm missing out on something that is important to me. To be in shul and to hear the davening has always been my experience of Rosh Hashanah, and to just be sitting in my house or sitting at the park, it's like I don't like it. And it's so interesting. He told me that one of the last Farbrengens that the Rebbe spoke at, his wife had had twins, and he couldn't go. And he had a sense he was missing something very, very important. And every Farbrengen he would miss, it would be painful to him. Like when he couldn't go on Motzi Shabbos, or when there was a weekday Farbrengen that he had to be in yeshiva or had to be home for his family, it would be very difficult. But he said he never forgot that Farbrengen. One of the last times he could have gone into Farbrengen with the Rebbe, and he said, I did not go because my wife needed me. And at that moment, I understood I'm giving up something for myself for somebody else. And he said, I'm not making it easier for you, but I'm letting you know this is a really important part of Judaism. That sometimes there's something we want, like spiritually, and someone else needs us physically, and we're making that choice, and Hashem is really, really seeing that choice. And I thought that was a beautiful answer, because he was also saying it's not just as a woman. There are periods of time in every person's life where they're going to have to make that choice. But then I was still, a little chutzpah. So I was like, oh, but like, why isn't there just like a Shulchan Aruch for women then that like says, okay, when you're single, you do this. When you get married, you just stay home. And then like, it's not so difficult. Like why every single like Yom Tov, every single time I have to figure out like, do I go to shul or not? And like, how do I hear shofar? And so he said, you can't have a Shulchan Aruch for women. That it defeats the whole purpose. The whole point of the Shulchan Aruch is laying out what you have to do at every moment. And women, and this drove me crazy for a while, but I'm working on it. Women have to intuit that their relationship with Hashem is beyond Shulchan Aruch sometimes. Sometimes you have to go past that. You have to go above it. It's a transcendent relationship. And so there's times in your life where you're going to be, what am I supposed to do? Shulchan Aruch. And there's times in your life where you're postpartum in a hospital bed and you can't wash and you need to eat a bagel and you just eat it. And like, and Hashem is like, that's what you need to do. And we have to have that realization within the context of, we want to keep halacha. We want to be connected to Hashem that way. We want to have like this like shul davening, learning relationship with Hashem, because we understand that's like, opening up that channel to God. But then when we understand that that's one facet of Judaism, then we realize as women, we go a step beyond that. We go to a step where we have to move with the times. We have to move with our bodies, with our children, with our spouse, sometimes just with our own inner emotions, things that, periods of time where like we're more overwhelmed or things are difficult. We have to recognize Hashem, we don't have a lesser Judaism because of that. And that's a really important piece, to not think that I'm missing out what's going on in shul. So like Simchas Torah, for example, is like a big one like this, where a lot of women feel like I'm missing out on like Simchas Torah. And I felt like that for sure over the years. I remember being on Shlichus, and 2 years later, I was like sitting in Morristown on like a plastic chair, watching like 5 men dance in a little circle. And I'm like, oh, this is so lame. And just like the juxtaposition was very difficult. And so like sometimes it's like recognizing like, I wish I could do something and I can't right now. Sometimes it's just like, that's just hard. I don't always find a clear path through in that moment. But what I have seen is that over the years, going through Tishrei, going through Pesach, over the years, I start seeing more and more about like finding like my unique Yiddishkeit that is really tailored to me in my life, in my personality, in my situation with my family. And each of us need to do this in our own lives. Like even a few nights ago, I had to like make a decision, and I was talking out with my husband, and sometimes he like gives me, you should do this, and I was like, don't tell me I should do this time, just like help me figure out what I want, and I was like, right, like he gave me like 3 options, and I just was like, okay, that one, like sometimes we have this inner voice that we don't make space for, but this is really important in our Judaism also, like to make space for that voice that's saying, you know what, this year I really want to be in shul. So that year, that Rosh Hashanah, I had a mantra, and I said, my children are not in the way of my avodas Hashem, they are my avodas Hashem. And that's what I carried with me that whole Tishrei. I said, my children are not getting in the way of me sitting in the sukkah. They're not getting in the way of me going to shul. They're not getting in the way of me sitting and learning with a friend. My children are my avodas Hashem. Shaking Lulav Nesrog with them, getting them to sing songs with me, like building my Yiddishkeit around them. That was like my mantra that Tishrei. The next year, I was in a different headspace, and I was like, you know what, this year I'm going to get a babysitter. And my son was like a little bit older, and he went and played with a friend, and then I had a baby, and I got a babysitter, and I went to shul for like 3 hours. And like that year is like, that's what I wanted to do. And so when we understand that, our relationship with Judaism just comes in these waves, the most crucial piece, and I'll say it again, is just to like really be honest with yourself, with what you need. And what I want to finish off with, and I'll take a look at some more of the questions and comments, but what I want to finish off with is, and the reason I brought this sikha is because our relationship with Judaism is absolutely about who we are. It's not about what we do. And we know that in our relationships with people, that at the end of the day, like with the people that really, really matter, it's really about who we are. That's why we're drawn to them. That's why we're close to them, especially for our children. If we're married, that's like, what is their mother? It's just the person that you are. And even so a million times with Hashem. Hashem made you, your neshama arose in his mind even before he created the world. And like the more we unpack that reality, then all of the ups and downs of our Jewish practice will fit within this paradigm. But the way that we really uncover that and live with it is by learning Chassidus. And so that's something that we can't live without. And so throughout all of the different stages of my life, I've always tried to find some way to be learning Chassidus. And sometimes it's, you know, going to graduate school to study the Rebbe Sichas, and I would, you know, have childcare and I have time to learn. And sometimes it would be like this, jumping onto a class in the evening to gain clarity and inspiration and ideas. A lot of times now it's like listening to podcasts. But that idea of our relationship with the Torah being holistic. The medium that we access Hashem's wisdom, like we have everything at our fingertips now. And so, you know, I generally don't like to give advice because it kind of contradicts the other thing I said, which is you have to listen to yourself. You have to like find that inner voice. And usually other people's advice is like hit or miss. But the only advice I will give is that if you take one thing away from this whole idea of like our relationship to Hashem being essential, our avodas Hashem being essential, is that how do we reveal that essence for ourselves is by learning Chassidus, is by learning what it means to be a neshama and a guf, what it means to be in this world, what it means to have a relationship with Hashem. And so Chassidus gives us that light. It shines that light in the dark times when the sun is in its phases and the night is dark. And when we have Chassidus, it shines that light for us. So I want to give us all a bracha as Jewish women that if you're single and you want to get married, you should find your soulmate immediately and you should come together with the other half of your soul. And those of you that are newly married and having children or your children are growing, that you find yourself in your Judaism and you make a space for it to feel fulfilling and good. And the times when it's like in a very dark phase, and just say, that's okay. I'm with Hashem. Hashem is with me. And I'm doing what I need to do. So, l'chaim. Okay, let's see what everyone's messages were.
Thank you so much, Chava. I definitely got so much from this. Just how to stay connected to myself and my Yiddishkeit and my part of life that I'm in. And there's a lot of letting go and reassessing and having good connections. So I really loved what I heard. I got so many nuggets, and I'm sure everyone here also did. So I wanted to say thank you. And thank you everyone who came. It's so good to see you all. And yeah, we'll see you at the next one.
Yeah, yes. And yeah, I can share the Sikha, the original Sikha, if anyone wants to take a look at it. I'll forward it to Michal.
Wonderful.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay. And yeah, also I will just send my in the chat my email if anyone wants to reach out. Available for, you know, chatting, following up with anybody. I also have a monthly newsletter I send out about women in Judaism. And I also will post like if I'm on podcasts or if I have like any appearances or some different thoughts. So I'll also send that, and you guys, if anyone's interested, can sign up.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys.
Thanks again.
Is there an ending or we just all like slowly leave the